College football nerds here doing a recap of one of the most fun college football weekends we've seen in a long time. This is quickly becoming our favorite segment of the week, and it is probably the best recap show on YouTube. I'm going to let y'all know just ahead of time, we're going to go long on this one because it's so much fun and there's so much that happened, so many implications, there's a lot to talk about. I want to remind y'all, if you're catching a cut up of this or even the full video, share this where you talk football, and it's going to help us out a lot. It's going to help get the word out. And again, let us know in the comments if you like us doing these shows, and we will continue. If not enough of you say that, then we won't. Let's get down to it, Josh. This Georgia-Tennessee game was so much fun to watch, but also, honestly, I don't know that it had huge implications throughout for the season, at the end of the year, because both these teams still have their playoff hopes in play, but it did give us some information, I think, about where these two teams are and maybe some things that we got right, some things that we got wrong. I want to start with Georgia. I picked Tennessee to win this game, but I did say on Twitter before the game started, maybe hedging a little bit, but I really believed this, that the Georgia we saw in the Austin Peay game the week before was not the offense that we were going to see against Tennessee. Against Austin Peay, Gunnar Stockton ran the ball 5 times, and against Tennessee, Gunnar Stockton ran the ball 13 times. Obviously, he was out of his mind throwing the ball. Do you think that Georgia was holding back, like they've done in the past, to really spring this offense with Gunnar Stockton on Tennessee? They only have one chance to do that. Or do you think this is just kind of who they were? Tell me what you think.
I think they held back, certainly to a certain extent. I mean, they do this every year. I mean, I don't know how many times we've seen Georgia go into their first major game and everybody says, oh, man, Georgia, they're just not very effective this year. The passing offense isn't really good. Quarterbacks aren't in sync, blah, 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 blah. They come out and they end up sort of steamrolling. I'm looking at like game logs for their passing offense. And, last year they opened with Clemson, a little bit different. But year prior, let's say 2023, right, Daniel? They were Ball State, 8.7 yards per. South Carolina, 7.7 yards per first couple games. Ended up at 9.4. 2022, ripped it again, Oregon, South Carolina early in the season. But then Kent State, Missouri, Auburn, 7.6, 7.3, 6.5 per. Kind of looking sluggish. 2021, they opened with Clemson. They went 4.5 yards per. Won the national title. Had a great passing attack through that season. Arkansas 2020, they opened at 5.7 yards per attempt. So I'm just saying, when you go through, there have been a lot of teams at Georgia that have had pretty good offenses, and when they haven't played a marquee game in week one, they very often kind of seem to sandbag. I mean, they look pretty good, but not what they can be. 9.5 per is very different. There were a lot of plays running and passing we saw from them that I don't think we'd seen previously, and so I do think their offense opened things up. But Daniel, with all these games, there's so much that's hard to sort of suss out because we don't know what all these teams are. I mean, I'm pretty confident that Tennessee, even without backup corners, is a better pass defense than Marshall or Austin Peay. I also don't know that Tennessee, without their starting corners, is a particularly good pass defense. So I do think they sandbagged a lot. I do think they showed things they hadn't shown previously. I do think Gunnar Stockton stepped up at the end of the game. But does that mean they're going to be a 9.5 yards per attempt defense versus Alabama or South Carolina or somebody else? I think that question's probably up in the air. What I can see is they're a better passing offense than they showed the first couple weeks. I just don't know if it's a one-off, if it's something about this game in particular. That's much harder to say.
And one of the things that we were consistent on in our preview and really talking about Tennessee all year so far, even in the offseason, was that Tennessee won the trade with UCLA. I think that's been proven out at this point. You weren't high on Nico last year. As the year went on, I got on the not so high on Nico boat. But what we do see with Joey Aguilar in this offense is he's really tailor-made for it. And he gets the ball out quick. And I think that that's the most important thing in this offense. But he also reads it really well. I'm really shocked. I know they mentioned in the broadcast that he spent, 14 hours a day or whatever learning the offense. I was shocked at how fluid this offense ran with him at the helm versus last year and maybe even the year before. He really sprung it on Georgia in a way that surprised me. 10.3 yards per attempt, 4 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions are kind of baked into who he is. But I made a joke in some preview or something this season saying I think Tennessee's going to suck this year. I was wrong. Like, they had a lot of replacements on defense, and I still think that this is going to be a very good defensive team as the year goes on, this Georgia game aside. Tell me what you think, though, in talking about both of these defenses. You maybe just alluded to it a little bit there. We haven't had this discussion in a while, but this felt like one of those games where the defenses aren't – I don't think Georgia or Tennessee have a bad defense. It's just in massive, epic games, a lot of times you see a lot of points where you wouldn't see the same amount of points in other games.
We do see this a lot, right? National championship games, conference championship games, frequently they end up being shootouts. I think the pressure on both teams makes you take more risks, drives up scores, and you end up having these sort of risk-reward games where you end up with a lot of points because really both teams are taking chances. And Daniel, it also means these games end up a little bit random in the result, right? It always kind of kills us when you get a game like this and it's close till the third or fourth quarter and a team is starting to take shots because they're down by 10 and all of a sudden they're down by 30 and people say, you thought it was going to be a 10-point game and they lost by 30. It's like, well, it was a 10-point game, but when they got down a bunch, this team started throwing deep and they threw interceptions instead of touchdowns. And if there's a tip ball at a certain point where if it goes the other way, this would have been a 3-point game instead of a 30-point loss. You can't predict that. I mean, we can kind of tell you how we think it's going to be. To that point, Daniel, when we talked about this game, we were both really right and also really wrong. I mean, we thought it was going to be lower scoring because we thought the defenses were going to be pretty good. We had concerns about Georgia's offense. We thought Georgia's defense was going to be excellent. Instead, we got a high-scoring game. Were we wrong about the offenses? Were we wrong about the defenses? Were we wrong about the flow of the game? I don't know. I mean, we were wrong, but trying to say what it is with one meaningful game on both sides is really difficult. I think one area where I was right, I mean, we talked a lot about how we thought it was going to be close. We talked about how we thought Georgia was vulnerable, how Tennessee had their best chance to just straight up win this game that they'd had it a long time. I think that proved true. I think both these teams showed that they have a lot of mettle. I think Tennessee showed that they're on the level where they can just straight up play with a team like Georgia. But I'll say when I picked Georgia, the reason I picked them is I said I thought at the end of the day their depth would be the thing that held out. And Daniel, I think that ended up proving true. I mean, the Tennessee injuries were probably a part of this. I think you're right. Aguilar, I think, is a gamer. I do think it'll be interesting to see how it goes along because something that flies under the radar last year, Nico was a 5-interception guy. They didn't produce a lot, but they didn't turn the ball over a ton either. It was just a lot of flailing, punting, relying on the defense. I think Aguilar is going to be a little more boom or bust. I think you'll see the same thing at Oklahoma. Aguilar is much better throwing on the move, which is, again, that was my big thing on tape early with Nico. When I saw him off his spot, throwing on the run, his mechanics would completely break down. He had to get his body completely turned and feet reset to throw. Aguilar doesn't have to do that. And like you said, it kind of makes him tailor-made for this offense, which has some RPO components, but it's about bringing numbers into the box and then throwing outside. Or when you go outside with safeties deep, you get numbers to run the zone read, which basically gives you an extra blocker to run inside. It's a pretty simple concept, but if you have a guy that's mobile, it helps because you have a lot of 5-man protections in that hypo scheme. It's hard to pass protect really well and give a lot of time, and so the quarterback ends up under a lot of pressure, and it's hard to throw under pressure. That worked well, but I will say they also scored on a lot of jump balls. And as long as the receivers are making the catches in those plays are going to look great, but when they play great DBs, there are going to be times when those passes probably will get picked because some great DBs in this conference are going to pick them. It's going to be interesting. So, yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, they're great teams, great defenses, great offenses. I think we don't know what's good or bad, almost like a scrimmage. I think I ended up being right that I think Georgia's depth in overtime ended up being the thing that won. I also think we'll see a little bit between the two who's, what the quarterbacks end up playing out in that system because Aguilar's not throwing laser beams. He's not Nico driving the ball 40 yards on a dot. And so in a 7-on-7 environment, he's not going to look as good, but he's more of a gamer. And, he's throwing these lobs that are very catchable, but probably are a little more, a little more prone to interception. And I think he's a little more inaccurate, actually, when his feet are set. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out the rest of the year.
The thing I like about him, though, is he doesn't need a perfect window to throw it in. He doesn't need a wide open guy to, the thing that Nico is really good at is throwing an 80-yard RPO slant and hit that in time. But that's, when you're throwing that, it's not super challenged. And it's, yes, he can throw that, make that perfect throw, but that perfect throw's not always there. And you did see Aguilar throw 2 interceptions on balls that, could maybe go either way or were questionable decisions. But I think you have to take the good with him with the bad, and he's going to give you plenty of points. Josh, one last note on this game before we go to the other ones. The thing that I've said for years about Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State, and obviously in any given year when a team is really good, you have a lot of this, but we've consistently seen it from these 3 teams, and it was so acutely present in this game. Games against teams like who Alabama was, who Ohio State probably is, who Georgia is, games against these teams are long. They are so long. You get up 21-7 and it feels like you're going to blow them out, and you wake up and you turn around and you're dead, right? Like this speaks to your depth point too, because when you get up 21-7 on a team that's, good, not great, then you lean on them the rest of the game. When you get up on a team 21-7, that's Georgia, over the course of time throughout the game, they just chip away at you. And that's what happened here. It was really impressive to see because we haven't seen that in a while. Josh, moving on to Texas A&M and Notre Dame. This is a game that we didn't have a lot of confidence, I don't think, in our pick in this game. I think both of these 2 teams are good teams, maybe not elite teams yet. And I think it showed in different ways. But the first one thing I want to point out to you, and I don't want to diminish A&M because they had to do this offensively, but were you a little bit surprised at Chris Ash's Notre Dame defense in this game? Not just the points, but overall how they played.
Yeah. Texas A&M has run the ball pretty well. They came into this game averaging about 5 yards a carry, but they got 4 yards a carry here. Texas San Antonio in the opener, and it was a blowout, but it was 108 yards rushing. Utah State's a sieve. They had 235, but on 45 carries, only about 5.2 per. And they had 3 touchdowns going into the game rushing and 3 touchdowns in this game against Notre Dame. To your point, it's starting to make me wonder a little bit about this Notre Dame run defense and how successful they're going to be. They've played 2 games, Miami and Texas A&M. Both teams ran for over 100 yards. A little more successful against Miami, 3.5 per 4 versus A&M. But I think the flip side, Miami, they hold them to 6.8 yards per attempt, which is pretty good. Miami had a hot streak in a couple drives. A&M had 9.7 per, but again, a few big plays. I don't think they're bad, Daniel. I'm not saying that at all. I think they're a good run defense. I think they're effective. I think they tackle pretty well. But the pretty well is the part you're referring to, right? Because last year's team was top 5 elite. We had them, tops in almost every major category. When we look at rush defense per carry last year versus expected, we had them a pretty elite unit. I don't know if they're that unit this year. And I know they had injuries and different things at the end of the season. I just don't know that I see it. I see a good run defense. I don't see an elite one. But even then, Daniel, some of it may be a little bit fool's gold. I'm looking through our numbers from last season. We had them 22nd in adjusted run defense. So it's not like they were as elite as my brain wants to make them out to be in pure run defense. I think their pass defense probably was the thing that carried them, and I'll check that real quick because I think, they were 3rd in our metrics in pass defense. I think what we're seeing is they lost a few key pieces in the back end. Maybe we talked about preseason, they didn't go as high in the draft as maybe was expected. But I think maybe they've lost some of those guys. The tackling on the back end hurt them. Obviously big plays like Craver in this game killed them, and it was a lack of tackling. And Daniel, I think that's the big thing. I think their run defense is good. I think it's not show-stopping elite, but it's good. And they would have been able to win with that if they had just contained the big plays on the perimeter and in the passing game. And a lot of Texas A&M's big plays in this game weren't complicated routes and necessarily hitting guys in stride on slants, high efficiency underneath and popping one with brilliant fade passes. A lot of them were stuff over the middle, stuff on the perimeter that just didn't get tackled and weren't boxed out or weren't angled correctly that went for big gainers. And so, honestly, Daniel, I'm a little concerned with the run game, but I think maybe the inability to dominate in run defense probably shows up more because they're not dominant in pass defense, if that makes sense. I think the run defense was more similar to this last year than we really give credit for. I think the difference is they were so dominant in pass defense that you just watch teams run the ball not quite well enough to get first downs, and it seems dominant, and you can't move on. Now they're running not quite well enough to get first downs, and then that's making Notre Dame adjust, and then they're giving up big plays in the back end. So, I mean, I do think Notre Dame's a very good team. I still think they're a very good team. I think they have a very good roster. I think Carr is going to be an effective quarterback for them. I question a little bit explosiveness at receivers, some other things, but that's nitpicking. But, Daniel, my big thing here is it seems like, once again, somehow they're worse than the sum of their parts. The thing I'm seeing with my eyeballs hasn't sort of coalesced into a more effective team. And it's a team that relies on Love and Price maybe a bit too much, when the reality at high-level college football, much like the NFL, is they end up getting you 4 yards a carry and 5.7 yards per carry. Elite backs, 100% elite backs, probably the best back tandem in the country, in my opinion. But you just can't rely on those guys alone enough versus a team like Texas A&M, who has so much high-level talent in the front seven. In a shootout, you're just not going to win on running backs like that unless you have enough pop and unless you have enough skill in the back end to be able to contain it.
So one concern I have, if I'm looking at this game for Texas A&M, who, by the way, has, as far as SEC schedules go, a pretty manageable one, especially given how Texas is looking right now. Texas A&M in the past has been a lot better than their ranking. This year, they don't have to be as good as they've been in the past and probably make the playoffs, given what their schedule looks like. One concern I have for them offensively is Marcel Reed. He made a lot of big plays last night, but there was a little boomer bust in there, and that concerns me a little bit. 360 yards and pretty good, actually really good, 9.7 per on 37 attempts. He only completed 17 passes. He completed 17 passes and had a ton of incompletions. They had 41 points, but they still punted 4 times, and they had a turnover. So there's 5 drives where they did nothing. Did you get the sense that A&M has a little bit of concerning reliance on boomer bust, and it worked out for them in this game where it might not in another? Or do you think that offense is going to be able to put up buckets of points every game?
Some boomer bust there. I mean, I was looking at some statistics and spreadsheets. I'm pulling one up right now. Texas A&M and Notre Dame. What was the win expectancy odds? About 66% for A&M, which isn't shocking. They win about 2 out of 3 times in this game. But Daniel, I think the thing that's notable in this is, like you said, 17 of 37. They completed less than 50% of their passes. That Craver pass was a great play off the side. That they broke some tackles. They had some plays with Concepcion going up and getting plays. Craver, they hit over the middle on a deep sort of dig route, post route. I'm not sure what the exact route was, but hit him deep down the field. Like, at times he threw great plays, but I talk about sometimes quarterbacks almost being like a random number generator. Like, he throws laser beams, but they're not particularly accurate. So if the laser beam is scattershot, when the laser hits you, it hits you, and it looks great. When the laser doesn't hit you, it doesn't show up in the highlight reel. So when you watch A&M in a 20-minute, 15-minute highlight video of the game, they're going to look fantastic. I think the reality, though, is you get a little scared when you see that much scattershot performance of the quarterback position, because there are going to be games where they don't hit the right plays at the right time, and suddenly the scoring production goes way down. So even when you talk about predicted outcome, that A&M wins 2 out of 3 times, and that was kind of what I was curious about, I think that in of itself is actually pretty deceptive. I think they hit the right plays when they needed to hit them, and if they do that, they can be a highly effective football team. But it's a lot like what we saw last year. I mean, the same thing's still true, right? When they're not hitting those passes, the offense could almost shut down. And so I think A&M is probably, like you said, they've got a manageable schedule, but this may be a team that beats LSU, Missouri, and Texas and loses to South Carolina and Florida. Like, I think that's entirely within the realm of possibility. They're going to be boomer bust all season because of the nature of the quarterback position in the passing game. And Le'Veon Moss is a really good tailback, but I just don't know that the offensive line in the running game is good enough to carry them, and I don't know if the defense is quite good enough to carry them. And so I see them as like a 10-2, 9-3 bubble playoff team right now. and it's going to be a bit random how they get there, and it's going to be a bit luck. Again, because the quarterback, I think, is just too inconsistent.
On the other side of the ball, CJ Carr, to me, when we said in our preview, what we felt was you had all these quarterbacks that were making their first starts this year. First start against a good team on the road against Miami for CJ Carr. We felt like he held his own. And for me, this game just solidified that it wasn't a one-off or that Miami just has a bad defense. I think Texas A&M has some issues defensively, and 7 of those points came off of that inexplicable punt block where they just didn't block the the main guy at the middle. To me, this game confirmed that when they made the right choice with CJ Carr, and two, the stage is not too big for him. I think he's going to be a very good passing quarterback for them. And I say passing quarterback because Riley Leonard was a good quarterback for them last year, but mostly with his legs. To me, this is the first time in a while that I've felt like that Notre Dame's got a quarterback that would complement a team if they were in the playoffs, because last year I think that was lacking.
I mean, I think they have the ability to throw themselves out of a hole, to deal with teams that load the box. Last year was a great run team. The best rush team in the country in our metrics. Number one in our per carry opponent adjusted metrics last year. Riley Leonard had a big part to do with that. I know we weren't high on him, but we weren't high on him as a passer. He was an effective runner, and because he was an effective runner, we talk about this all the time. There's all kinds of subtle things schematically it does to a defense when you have to defend the run, especially in the zone read or whatnot. Basically, it's like an extra blocker. But if teams were good enough to stack the box and stop the run, the offense would slow down. And we talk about all the time, we've talked about it for years, it is a statistical certainty, and we've seen it in our modeling every single year. Teams are much more able to stop the run than they are the pass. We do all this opponent adjusted, defensive metric stuff where we talk about are you allowing more or less than your opponent averages, right? If you look at who your teams played and then how those other teams did against everybody else, are you allowing, taking a team that allows 4 yards a carry, and are you allowing 5? Or are you allowing 3? It's really common to see elite defenses, somebody like 2018 Clemson, who had one of the best defensive lines in the history of college football. They would hold a team to about 50% of their rushing production on average. It was like 50 percentile. Teams commonly hold teams under 40 to 50% under their averages if you're a truly elite 2016 Alabama, 2018 Clemson, whatever defense. Pass defense, the elite pass defenses in a given season can hold you to 20 to 30% below your average. That's it. Like you could be the top, like the 10th best pass defense in the country, and you only hold a team to 80% of their averages. Like you can't do much better than that. Meaning passing games really get about what they get. And so when you look at a rush offense, Daniel, and a rush first offense, they're great to beat a weak schedule and to get you to a playoff because rushing games crush lower level opponents, right? You lean on them with physicality, you get momentum through the game, you leverage depth. It's consistent. But when you play elite teams, when you get in the playoff, it's just hard to string together wins if you play a top level passing game and you don't have one. Because both defenses are probably pretty good. And I don't want to I feel like this has been overly negative, and it in some ways probably has been, because I think these are two good teams. I'm just not sure what to make of them. But I will say, like last year, there weren't a lot of top offenses spread out through the playoff. And I do think Notre Dame got a little bit lucky, frankly, that they got all the way to the final without having to play a high-level passing team that would really make them be stressed to see what they were. No, Indiana had great passing statistics, but they didn't have the roster to support it. They didn't have to see what they'd be like to be stressed in that game, really, until Ohio State. And Leonard delivered in that environment, but a bit of a one-off. I don't think it's realistic to expect that. The rejiggered playoff means you're going to face an Oregon and an Ohio State. It was kind of broken the way it played out. And so I agree with you. I think Carr gives them a bigger weapon. And even if they're a worse team this year than they were last year, I actually think they're more likely to win a title. And they're more likely to beat a team that has a high-level offense and a more complete team than they were.
Moving on to what, I say the shocker of the day, but a lot of people thought Georgia Tech might beat Clemson. It was a fun game to watch. The kick at the end, you and I talked about how it worked. So, the complaints kind of fall on deaf ears, but the play clock management at the end of that game was pretty wild. Engagement management I thought was a little lacking, but in general, whatever. Georgia Tech won. They beat Clemson. You and I have the receipts of being really confused about the Clemson hype coming into this season. A lot of people had them number one. LSU shot up to number 2 or 3. Some people put them number 1 on their list after they beat Clemson on the road. But Josh, this is a big win for Georgia Tech on one side, but it's also kind of concerning for where Clemson is at coming out of this game because they're kind of in no man's land.
Talk about quarterbacks being random number generators. It feels like it's the story with a lot of the top QBs right now. Klubnik can make any throw on the field, and there are times where when he's throwing dots, he looks phenomenal. And I actually watched this game with a good buddy of mine who's a big Clemson fan. It just it's so frustrating, and it was kind of interesting, listening to him vent through the game. That was like, man, how many times does Klubnik have the play in front of him and just not see it or not execute it? And then the next drive, he goes out and hits 2 great plays in a row and then misses the third. And I talk a lot about sort of from a game theory perspective, the way football operates. Inconsistency is a killer. And the reason it's the killer, really, is that if you can make 2 out of 3 throws, it doesn't matter how covered they are, you're going to hit 2 out of 3 throws. You'll hit bang completion, and then you'll hit incompletion. And the completion might get you a first down, run for 3 yards on first down, 2nd and 7, miss the throw, now it's 3rd and 2nd, and you're 3rd and long. I mean, the nature of football as a game is decided not just by 4 downs, but really by 3 down sets. Means if you're inconsistent, Klubnik's barely over a 500 passer, those great plays get sandwiched between periods of missing plays. And in the new world of college football, where defenses have really shifted to this idea of I want you to have a 10-plus play drive, you can really defend Clemson by just saying, hey, I'm just going to make you work the whole field and just wait for the series of downs where you screw up. And that's exactly what you saw, Daniel, right? 8 yards per attempt for Klubnik. Randall was 5.3 yards per carry. Brown, only got 2 carries, but 26 yards. They, on a per play sense, were pretty good. From a passing perspective, rushing perspective, out through Georgia Tech 8 yards per attempt to 7.5. Outran Georgia Tech 5 yards per carry to 3.5. The problem was that yardage came too much in chunks. And because it came in chunks, they would have a big play for 30 or 40 yards, and then a couple plays struggle to get a first down and sputter. And then they'd sputter and punt. And then they get the ball and have a chunk play and then sputter. And that's their whole offense right now. A lot of that is due to Klubnik and who he is as a quarterback, frankly. I do also think under the radar a little bit. I don't think the offensive line's fantastic. I don't think they have a marquee running back. Without Shipley, without Maffa, I just don't know that Randall is that guy, and certainly they don't have a rotation. I agree. We have a Conference Commandos is a guy that we talk to sometimes on Twitter, who's he's pointed out to me a couple weeks ago that we were probably sleeping on Clemson's receiving core, and I think he was right. I think Moore and Wesco are great. I think they really miss Antonio Williams in that receiving core right now, but there's just not enough splash outside the receivers. And the other side of it, Daniel, we talked about this when we talked about not buying into the hype. And the biggest reason we said, hey, I don't really buy in the hype is that Clemson was in the 40s to 60s in our defensive statistics, rushing and passing. They were not a very good defense last year, period. And Georgia Tech, they held them to 24 points. They held them pretty good statistically. They're improved defense. I think Clemson's improved defensively. They're just improved is still not elite. They're not great. They're the 30th best defense in the country. And offensively, they took a little bit of a step back. And when you put those two things together, man, it's just not an elite unit. And I think Georgia Tech's a good team. Look, I think Haynes King's a gamer. I think they run a great scheme. They're very effective. The biggest thing is they're consistent, and they took care of opportunities in order to win the game. That most of the time Clemson, I think maybe Clemson even wins that game. But it's just not... it's kind of frustrating, right? Clemson wins this game, 68% of the time, but the inconsistencies in where things fall are such that they're going to lose winnable games a lot, and they're going to turn around and blow.
Yeah, talking about inconsistency, Klubnik with 8 yards an attempt, but he had one 73-yarder that wasn't a long pass. It just went for a long touchdown. You take that one away, and the rest of the game, he was 5 yards an attempt, 5.15. That's non-functional. Like 5 yards an attempt as an offense, you can't run your offense that way. You just can't. And so, you take a 30-yard run off the board from Randall, and then you're down to 3 yards of an attempt running the ball. And it's interesting because Georgia Tech won this game, and it was the difference in this game was turnovers. Clemson turned it over twice. Georgia Tech, obviously, no turnovers. They win the game. That's the difference. But if you're playing with such tight margins because you're so inefficient, it kind of goes back to A&M's offensive approach as well. If you're that inefficient, you can't afford turnovers. You can't afford to be -1 in the turnover margin, or you lose the game. That's a tough way to go, man. That is a really tough situation. Look at it, a couple of ACC schedules. Interesting to me in terms of talking down the road playoff situation. Clemson may not finish ranked because they've still got Florida State. They're not. I don't think they're currently ranked. So if they don't finish the season ranked, then the only ranked opponent Georgia Tech will play this year is Georgia. The rest of their schedule is Temple, Wake, Virginia Tech, Duke, Syracuse, NC State, Boston College, and Pitt. Pitt might end up ranked, but those are some bad teams. Looking at Cal's another ACC team that they won't play a ranked team all year. There's not a ranked team on their schedule. Cal somehow avoids Georgia Tech, Florida State, Miami, and Clemson on their schedule. What do we do, Josh, with these teams that are really playing a different sport? And this isn't Cal's fault. This isn't Georgia Tech's fault. But, if you are a team in the ACC that avoids all 4 good teams because we've done this expansion thing, and we've got the same thing with Michigan won't play a ranked team in conference until their last game of the year. Illinois might only play 1 this year. What do we do in a situation where you have Cal, who will not play a ranked team all year? Let's say they go 11-1 versus a team that goes 9-3 and plays 7-8 ranked teams in the row in the SEC.
Realize what you're saying right now, Daniel, is basically the whole situation with SMU last year, right? Because they played BYU and they played Louisville in the regular season, and really nobody else, right? It was like those were the only 2 bowl teams I think they played. Maybe there were a couple other bowl teams. But I know we were looking at top 40 teams, and those were really the only 2 they played. They lost BYU, and they won by 7 against Louisville. Then they go to play Clemson in the conference championship game, and they lose 34-31. What I would say to that, Daniel, is the same thing I said last year with SMU. We don't like punishing teams for losing in conference championship games. I think there's good rationale for that relative to teams that don't play in a conference championship game. But I think you have to sort of evaluate that on equal schedules. First, I would say if you're one of these teams that's in the situation where you miss the teams that are good in your own conference, the way SMU did last year, and then you get in the conference championship game as a result, and you have a situation where, again, I think SMU was, as I recall, they were either the weakest or second weakest strength of schedule in the entirety of P4 when they went to conference championship game. That game has to be an elimination game. Right? I mean, if you don't have the strength of schedule that the other teams you're being compared to have, and you're not, look, it can happen when you're not remotely close. The conference championship game has to be an elimination game. We used to see it with Iowa and Wisconsin and a lot of teams out of the Big Ten West for years. It was reasonable. We used to see it at times with the Big 12. You'd get Missouri get in the conference championship game. You get Kansas get in the conference championship game. Hey, if you lose that game, you're just out. The SEC East has had that a number of times. Lose the SEC East SEC championship game, you're out. That's the only approach you can take, is when it's this lopsided, the conference championship game must be an elimination game, first off. And so in the SMU scenario, when they lost to Clemson, the issue was you only played 2 truly good teams. 2 teams that were as good or in the range of good as 8 teams that South Carolina and Alabama were playing. That game has to be an elimination game. And the second thing, Daniel, look, we've talked about this a ton. I hate moving to non-conference championship games in that predictably we have already seen teams are kind of cancel out of conference games, which means the ability to do data, but for our sake between conferences is completely blown up. But if we're going to play this win-loss record game, which is what the committee did last year, which is why all these ADs like Florida canceling all these home and homes, why they're making this decision to say, hey, if we go to 9 conference games, I got to drop an out-of-conference game. It doesn't make the schedule harder, no matter what 9 conference game people say. It is somewhat true, Daniel, that going to 9 conference games is kind of important because of the scenario, because the committee's ability, or at least last year, inability to properly consider the situation. Because when you play 9 conference games, the odds of someone dodging all those top teams does go down. And it does mean that schedule parity within a conference becomes a big deal. And ultimately, Daniel, what we're highlighting in all this discussion is this is not about SMU versus Alabama, right? The problem is within the conference, SMU probably was not as good as Miami last year. And we didn't know that. Intra-conference scheduling has gotten more broken because of expansion. It's way too easy to miss the good teams in your own conference. And so conference championship games as an elimination game become more important. And frankly, this is why they had to expand to 9 conference games, because without it, it's just impossible to have anywhere near equal schedules. And that makes making the conference championship game grossly unfair for some teams versus others.
And I'm going to put, to kind of further your point, because what we ran into last year, and on its face, I understand and appreciate the argument. At some point, you got to win your games. I think that comes a little bit, though, from kind of an NFL mindset where there is a lot of parity. And, okay, if the AFC is a little bit better than the NFC, we might have a little bit of mismatch in the playoffs for the Super Bowl or whatever. Like, I get that. But there is so little parity in college football, and this didn't used to be a problem in the way that it is a problem right now. I don't think people mentally have fully adjusted the fact that these conference expansions, Josh, have led to the ability, like you said, to not know who's good in conference because you're missing all of the good teams. I've got, hopefully at some point, I'm showing Cal's schedule. And for the podcast listeners, the best team on Cal's schedule is probably worse than the Wisconsin team that Alabama beat Saturday and could have beaten them 56-10. That's how different we are in terms of looking at schedules, on one side versus the other. It's not just win all your games. There's 35, 40 teams in college football that could go 11-1, 12-0 with this schedule. And that's not an exaggeration. This is not normal ACC during Clemson's rain week schedule. This is really bad schedule. You've got several teams on Cal's schedule, remaining schedule, that have already lost out of conference to bad teams. Boston College lost to Stanford by 10 points yesterday, and Stanford got blown out by BYU and lost to Hawaii, who is also on their schedule. So they're different sports. They're really different sports, and people complain about subjectivity in the selection process and that it's an invitation and that there's all this bias. To be frank, you cannot do this without some subjectivity and without some real consideration for schedules, because even within conference, going back to your point, Josh, Florida State plays Alabama out of conference. Cal, who doesn't play Florida State, played Minnesota out of conference. And then Florida State has to play Miami. And then Florida State has to play at Clemson. And then Florida State has to play Florida. Like, these are two totally different worlds. And I don't know how we rectify it other than, maybe dropping another G5 or directional game and force everybody to play 9+2. Because we're also losing a lot. Florida announced today that they're canceling schedules with future games with like Arizona State and a couple other out of P4 home and homes. Josh, what do we do now that everybody's doing the 9 to bring this a little bit more equalized to understand? Because now you've introduced a new problem. 9 in the SEC versus 9 in the Big 12 or the ACC are totally different And so now you are doing this cannibalization thing within the SEC, within the Big Ten that other conferences aren't doing. So I think we also need to keep those external games.
Doing the like 4-4-2-2 thing, right? Like why the conferences have a set number of slots. I don't like it in abstract theory. If we had an ideal version of the sport, but the more we move to this model, the more we say, hey, conferences, you need to just play for the championship to play for your title. Quite frankly, the Big Ten and the SEC are rightly saying, okay, if this is the model we're going to go to and say, if you win your championship, you get in the playoff, our best teams are better than your best teams in terms of depth. Maybe the best ACC team, like Miami, I think Miami's legit this year. And we'll see if that pans out, but I think they are right now. I don't know how far down that chain that goes. Miami's legit. Florida State, I think, may well be legit. I think we may figure out that Florida State is a legit playoff team. Alabama losing that game may not have been really anything to be ashamed of. Notre Dame, 0-2, maybe against great teams. We don't know all that stuff. But what I can say, Daniel, I don't think the ACC has 4 teams that can run with the 4th best team in the SEC. I don't think they got 4 teams that can run with the 4th best team in the Big Ten. Because when, like the Big Ten, right, number 3 is Oregon. Number 4 is Illinois. What's the 4th best team right now in the ACC? What is it? I mean, it's probably Georgia Tech. Maybe SMU. I mean, number 3, 4, and 5, I'm looking at FPI right now for whatever it's worth. It's Clemson, Georgia Tech, SMU. And so when we're talking about those kinds of teams, do you really think Georgia Tech is going to run with Oregon? I think they're pretty good, but I don't think they're Oregon. And so when you talk about playoff slots, I got to throw my hands up and say, I can't blame the major conferences for saying, look, we're just going to get 4 in. Because if we're going to play this game of saying we're not going to schedule out a conference anything meaningful, then we talk about all the time concepts of siloing. I've talked about a Polaroid picture, right? Even within our own data, I warn about this a lot. Our data cannot properly normalize for the fact that you play isolated schedules in your own bubbles. It's like a Polaroid of the peaks. You take the highest mountaintop in the Rockies and the highest mountaintop in the Himalayas and you put them next to each other. They're just going to look high relative to each other within their own photo. You can't tell which one's taller. That's the problem we have. And if that's the real problem and the committee can't see past it subjectively, which we established last year, where the seating at the bottom end was just bad, and ignore the game of who got in and didn't get in. The seating itself was bad, how they ranked everybody. Now you end up in the reality of the conference is rightly saying, we can't trust you, so we're going to rank the teams within our own conference. We know who's best to worst, relatively speaking, who's best to worst within the Big Ten, within the SEC. We played enough. If we play 9 conference games, we can kind of sort that out. And we're just going to take our top 4. We'll play your top 4. And the entire discussion about what's the best conference or not is going to be limited to the top teams in the playoff environment. And that's the best we end up with. And Daniel, I really hate that too. Because last year we said the whole year, the top of the Big Ten is just as good as the top of the SEC. The difference was the middle third of the SEC was a lot better than the middle third of the Big Ten. The bottom third of the SEC was way better than the bottom third of the Big Ten. The bottom half of that conference was bad. That is all just going to get lost. It's going to become irrelevant, and it's going to be about being one of the top 4 teams. Yes, it's going to make some conversations more interesting, but even there, does it? I guess it'll be more interesting to make the playoff, but we are really pushing the whole thing now about just making the playoff, seeding. The regular season is not that relevant, and the whole discussion, the whole conference discussion is just going to be about, hey, all right, you made the playoff now, and the playoff is the sole determiner of what conference is better or worse. We didn't play regular season out of conference games. Even if you did, your schedules were so disparate it didn't matter. Is that better? I don't know. People in the comments, do you think that's better or is it worse? Because I genuinely don't know, but that's the situation we find ourselves in. And frankly, I think it's the only solution to the problem that we've somehow created, not through playoff expansion, but...
And it's tough because to do those out-of-conference games, you also have to do them first, second week of the season, where teams are so much better throughout the year. It doesn't tell a full picture, but maybe it tells a little bit of a picture. All right, Josh, moving on a little bit on kind of rapid fire on some of these other games. You mentioned Alabama Florida State game, and it may turn out that Alabama losing that game wasn't that big of a deal. I am one of the people who also thinks Florida State is legit. Now, I think they're going to drop a game or two on their schedule because some teams will have more tape on that offense and how they're operating it with Castellanos. But I still think they're super legit. They're super physical, a lot of speed on that team. They're going to win a ton of games. The people that say that's a 2-10 team are ridiculous. But Alabama just absolutely earholed Wisconsin yesterday. And what I said going into that game to a friend who asked me what I thought about it was Alabama will cover, and we still won't know a lot about them. I want to say that mostly I still feel that way, and we'll do a preview in 2 weeks for the Alabama Georgia game, so I don't want to get too much into that. But the one thing I will say is, even against air, Ty Simpson is showing me that he's probably, like, given how bad all of the established or hyped quarterbacks were coming into this year, I think Ty Simpson's probably a first-round quarterback, just the way he processes, the way he throws. And that's not saying a lot because I think it's a very weak draft class. But in the least, I think from week one to where we are now, the Alabama passing game, especially paired with what looks to be maybe the deepest wide receiver unit in the country, not the best because that's still probably Ohio State. Josh, give me your thoughts on Alabama. Do you think we know more about them, or is it still a complete enigma because they haven't played elite competition yet?
Teams that are sort of one-dimensional in various facets. In Wisconsin's case, without their starting quarterback, again, in sort of a long-running curse that's probably tied to somehow cheese and beer, they have a great defensive unit and a terrible offense. And is what they are defensively determined by the fact that they get behind and then they sort of lose hope and they have to be overly aggressive because they can't give up any more points or they have no way of winning. Last year, Wisconsin had a ton of injuries in the defensive line. It kind of broke them defensively. They were not a great defensive unit. They're much healthier this season. They went into this game with Alabama having given up only 67 total yards. They were fourth in the country in run defense. So I think this Wisconsin defense might be quite good. I don't know how good. Really don't know how good. But even when you look at them the last two games, I mean, they struggled in the opener with Miami of Ohio. They win 17-0. But that's also a game where Miami of Ohio had 117 yards. It's not like their defense has been a problem. Miami of Ohio didn't get a first down conversion. They didn't convert a third down in that game. They only had 7 first downs, period. I mean, Middle Tennessee State, they won 42-10. Gave up some points early, but again, total yardage 241 for Middle Tennessee State, 5 of 14 on third down. Only 14 first downs in the game. So I think Wisconsin is a one-sided team. I think they're probably very good defensively. I don't know how good, but maybe quite good. I think their secondary can be a little bit vulnerable. I think the run defense might well be elite, and they have no offense. All that to say, how do you evaluate Alabama in this game? And one of the interesting things that I like to talk about a lot is the way in which fans or even media, I think, misperceive offenses based on the length of the game. And, Brooks Austin, you were having a reply to a thing you put on Twitter, Daniel, to point out Georgia in their game with Tennessee ran, I think, 96 plays. Alabama and Wisconsin combined for 103. Alabama had 9 possessions in this game. Georgia had 14. And again, we're going to do a preview, but I'm just sort of pointing out that if you look at where Georgia was at the 9th possession, I think they were up to 27-24. And so, I think there's no way to take anything but positive from the fact that Alabama scored 38. And it's not just they scored 38. They scored 38 without punting until 9 minutes left in the fourth quarter. They went a turnover on down once. Otherwise, they scored touchdown, field goal. And the field goal, again, is when they were, in the fourth quarter, kind of slowing things down, not trying to be explosive, had third string guys. Yeah, that's true. They dropped a wide open touchdown in the end zone at that point, didn't they, with Williams? They have really found their rhythm offensively. I think they found their rhythm against a defense that's probably a very good unit. Wisconsin's not going to be a fantastic team, but when we talk about trying to suss things out, I can't even say for sure, given the way Georgia's defense looked, Daniel, that Georgia's defense is going to be that much better than Wisconsin's. I mean, it's going to be much harder because it's going to be more of a balanced game. And so I think you have to give a lot of credit to what Alabama is. You especially when you realize how short the game was and how much, if this was a 14 possession game, I mean, the rate they were scoring, what would that, I mean, they'd score, about 60 points? So, I think the biggest difference to your point, though, Daniel, one, the running back rotation, they've completely flipped. They have a freshman that was started this game that was the number 3 guy in the Florida State game. The guys that were supposed to be the backups that are playing because their starter injured have been bad. Young and Hill. I saw it on tape in the Florida State game, saw it on tape in the Wisconsin game. I just don't think they're very good, or they haven't figured it out. They're really missing Jam Miller. And so they have the Riley kid they figured out. And then Ty Simpson missed a lot of conversions with errant throws, was really slow and hesitant in the opener. First major start, really first start of his career, right? And this game, he looked like a very different quarterback after the first series. Kind of ended in turnover downs in a similar situation. Got his confidence, got his rhythm. I don't know if I'll say he's a first-round draft pick, but he's much better. Same way, you were super high on Jam Miller. I think he's a very good back. I don't know that he's the best back in the country, but I do think he's a very good tailback, and I think they're kind of missing that. So this Alabama team, as they find confidence, I think is going to be a very, very good offense. And if they find confidence defensively, this team could every bit the part of the top 5 playoff juggernaut return to form team than we thought they were, despite the clunker, which was a clunker from them in the opener. But Daniel, I'm increasingly wondering, again, we haven't seen Florida State play much, but I'm really wondering if that was a clunker in the opener because they played a bad game against what may prove to be a top 10 team. Not that they played a bad game. I think this may end up being a very different situation than last year, Alabama versus Vanderbilt. I think Florida State may be a tremendously better team, and this Alabama team may well be. Even right now, they're not a top 10 team, and I think we may end up realizing that there's a gross underranking of that football team.
I think Alabama, just on what they have left, I think they have like 8 of 9 remaining games are against ranked teams or something like that. 7 in a row. It's insane. Go ahead.
I will say, Daniel, a little bit of that is that the AP poll right now is truly just kind of ranking every SEC team by default. Like, I don't know that Missouri's really a properly ranked team. I don't know that Auburn's a properly ranked team. I don't know that Vanderbilt's a properly ranked team because they beat South Carolina without Sellers. So it is a hard schedule, Daniel, but I question it a little bit because I do think, LSU at number 3 is a great example. Like, is their schedule really that hard? And I'll let you finish. And then, Daniel, maybe we could talk a little bit about LSU and the AP poll and where it is, and then transition maybe to a discussion of Vanderbilt and South Carolina in that game.
But we have at least enough information to know that Alabama plays a Tennessee team that just went toe-to-toe with Georgia. Alabama plays an Oklahoma team that just beat probably a top 5 or 6 team in the Big Ten in Michigan. I think there's enough information there to know that this schedule, especially when juxtaposed against some of the other schedules, is tough. And I was saying that to say that Alabama's path this year, if they want to be who they've been in the past, is who Ohio State was last year, in that they lost 2 games. Alabama's a 10-2, 9-3 type team and could be hell on wheels in the playoffs. But I just think that there's too many pieces that they got to figure out. And they still have a lot of injuries. Overton went down yesterday. James Smith went down yesterday. I know there's small nagging injuries, but like Keenan still hasn't played yet. Jam still hasn't fully come back. We don't know if these guys are going to be ready for Georgia or not. So I think there's still a long way to go. But I do think it's a lot better than people wanted to make it out to be based on the Florida State game in week 1. To your point about the AP poll, it's very interesting because the one that's interesting to me, there's 2 for me that stick out. One, LSU ahead of Miami, which is wild. LSU at 3 is crazy. And number 2 is Iowa State, who barely beat Kansas State and really barely beat Arkansas State yesterday. And Arkansas State is a team that Arkansas beat by like 40 points 2 weeks ago. So those 2 are interesting to me, but I'll let you kind of go off on the AP poll.
Put out stuff on Twitter at random, and I'll own the AP poll tweet for all the angry LSU fans. Look, it's not like I'm saying LSU is going to finish a terrible team. LSU was unranked to end the year last year. They started the AP poll at 9. Every AP Voter had them in the top 13 despite finishing unranked. Just the same way that every AP Voter had Clemson in the top 9 despite finishing 14th. And we talked about that. We talked about it in the preseason stuff, Daniel. We talked about it in the LSU Clemson preview video. We talked about it on Twitter. It was a big red flag, right? That you're putting a lot of faith. Every single person is putting a ton of faith in both those teams improving dramatically. LSU's undefeated. They've won their games, and that's going to be the LSU, mantra about why they should be where they are. Daniel, I don't have a problem with LSU being ranked, but beating Florida 20-10 after Florida loses to South Florida in a game where, Florida probably should have won, but there's a reason they lost. Beating Clemson 17-10 in a Clemson team that lost to Georgia Tech. Again, maybe kind of woulda, coulda, shoulda beat Georgia Tech, but just isn't that much better. 23-7 against Louisiana Tech. There's nothing about LSU that tells me they're a top 5 team. I buy them being a top 20 team. I'm not saying they're bad. I don't see them being top 3. Like, what on the field this year, if you ignore the preseason ranking of Clemson, if you ignore where Florida was preseason, what about this year, when you look at all the other games these teams have played, tells you LSU, with the way they're playing right now, is a top 3 team in the country? Because I've seen Miami go out and dominate teams. I've seen Georgia just beat Tennessee. I've seen Oregon beat dominant. I've seen Florida State beat Alabama. And you got LSU ahead of all of them? Like, from a dominance perspective, from a current ranked wins perspective, there's no reason to have LSU number 3. And Daniel, the same thing I think is true of Iowa State. I mean, Iowa State is ranked 12th because Iowa State started the season high, because voters got to have a Big 12 team high. They didn't know who to rank. That was another thing I flagged in the AP poll. The biggest point of uncertainty was that who in the Big 12 was ranked high. It's clear the AP voters have no idea who's good in the Big 12 or not. Maybe they just don't know how to predict it. Maybe they just don't know enough about the teams. But it was completely stinking random. If it was Kansas State, Iowa State, TCU, whatever, it's just all kinds of random teams, up and down, unranked or 10th, right? Like, just somebody, they felt like they had to pick a Big 12 team in the top 15, and they just didn't know who to do. And so you ended up with 17th Kansas versus number 12 Iowa State in the opener. Iowa State won that game. Everybody was watching because it was opening weekend in Ireland. And I don't think people have followed well enough to know Kansas State, by the way, just dropped 2 straight games to Army and Arizona. They're 1-3. That was not, as it turned out, an impressive game. I mean, Johnson at Kansas State, we flagged that, look, Kansas State looks like they've got a pretty good roster, but the quarterback is majorly a problem, and they are majorly a problem. Beyond that, Iowa State beat Iowa 16-13, and as you said, 24-16 Arkansas State. There is no reason on earth that you have 4-0 Iowa State over 3-0 Ole Miss, 3-0 Georgia Tech, who just beat Clemson, 3-0 Indiana, 3-0 Vanderbilt, like Auburn, Missouri, USC, Iowa State, based on how they played on the field, and you ignore the preseason ranking of Kansas State and realize who Kansas State is, Iowa State should barely be ranked right now, based on the field play, who they played, how they played against them. Everything, Daniel, like we talk about, there's nothing wrong in and of itself with a preseason poll. The problem is when you have a preseason poll and you allow the preseason poll to dictate your future rankings just based on whether teams are moving them up and down, not recalibrating your expectations based on teams are, not recalibrating based on who their opponents are. That's why we don't use priors in our formula and methodology when we do our 1 through 133, when we run our model. Yeah, it would make it slightly more accurate against the mean. People point this out all the time and say it's ridiculous not to. But we do it because you're allowing your assumptions to drive the result. And even if it's more accurate, it's just confirming what you assume to be true. You're not reevaluating. In my opinion, Miami should be number 2 right now. They've got the most impressive resume. They've looked really good. I think Texas probably ought to be behind Alabama and Tennessee. Those 2 teams have looked better. They've played. Texas has the best loss, but Alabama and Tennessee in their wins has looked like far better teams. Penn State and Illinois are pure projections. So if you're going about earning it on wins, I don't understand why they're not behind like Texas A&M and Oklahoma, who've earned it on the field. Probably Georgia Tech even has an argument over Penn State and Illinois right now. Again, other than projection. If you believe in Miami, South Florida probably ought to be ranked. They beat Florida, and they lose to a team that's probably top 3. And again, it's so frustrating, Daniel, and I'll let you riff because I know it's a frustration for you too. It's not a problem to me to have a poll early if you're willing to sit down, look at the teams, and reevaluate everything fresh. I just think the AP poll voters, as you sort of pointed out on Twitter, because we caught something really stupid last week, they're really lazy. And they see where they were ranked last week. I think they look at who won and lost, and they moved them up and down. And they don't look at the whole landscape of college football and recalculate all their perceptions. And usually there's enough wins and losses through the season that eventually gets to where it needs to be. But it's frustrating because the preseason polls determining where they're at right now, and it's currently, I think, in the transfer portal era and everything else, there's so much topsy-turviness. We were right to say that the top 10 this year was probably going to be one of the least accurate in years. And the AP poll is still so latched onto that I think the top 25 is borderline ridiculous right now.
The problem I have a couple of problems, right? But the first problem I have is, and you kind of hinted at it, some of what the AP poll does for some of the teams is based on who they've beaten. And some of the AP poll for some of the teams is based on where they were in July or August, wherever the first preseason poll comes out. But you can't it's got to be consistent across the board, or you come up with this amalgamation of, mess, honestly, because there's no coherency here. Another point on LSU, because LSU fans are all over us about this, but you've beaten closely 2 unranked teams. At this point, Clemson and Florida aren't ranked. Clemson and Florida are great brands. That doesn't mean they're great teams. Miami absolutely dragged USF up and down the field Saturday. That game was a blowout. So Miami destroys, and look, this is transitive property, I get it, but right now we're going on data. What data do we have right now that suggests LSU is the third best team in the country? Because we have Miami beating the crap out of a team that beat Florida. They beat Florida at Florida. Florida threw 5 interceptions, and LSU was in a dogfight with them. But here's another one. LSU beat Louisiana Tech the week before 23-7. Nussmeier threw for 5.8 yards per attempt. They ran for 3.8 yards per carry. This offense is bad. This offense is objectively bad. Now, I think LSU's defense might be pretty good. But when we're talking about the number 3 team in the country, do we really think LSU beats Oregon right now? Or Florida State? Or Georgia? Or Miami? I don't know. And then if Miami got a lot of credit for beating Notre Dame, who's still ranked, and they beat them at home, A&M went up there and beat them on the road, but they're down there at 10. Like, it's just very disconnected in what they're giving credit for what you've done on your resume. And then obviously still everything is a nod to where we were preseason. There's so much priors going on here. And it's not even week to week. It's where they were at the beginning of the year. And like you said, if they don't lose, they don't drop. Well, that's not really fair, because not only do we have more information about LSU's win over Clemson, because that's what shot them up the rankings, like then Clemson goes and loses to Georgia Tech, we also have existing information and new information about their win over Florida. And all this sounds like a rant against LSU. LSU might go undefeated, and more power to them. But we don't have that information yet. We have them struggling against La Tech and beating two unranked teams close. That's what we have. And for that, you're number 3 in the country. Well, okay, Florida State won by 2 touchdowns over what they have as the number 14 team in the country. That seems like a bigger accomplishment to me. We could go all day on this, and I don't want to because we've got other stuff to talk about. Other previews to do, but Josh, this was a really fun weekend in college football, and I would love for you to wrap it up for us with a parting shot.
I mean, the parting shot I'll give, sort of a nod to Vanderbilt. Again, you talk about rankings. Vanderbilt sitting there at 20th in that game with South Carolina, and I unfortunately want to highlight something there too, right? One, is Vanderbilt great or legit? I mean, I think they showed offensively what happens when Pavia is healthy and that offense is going. They're a difficult system. They're a legitimately good team the same way they were to start last year. We talked about it a lot. That was not the ugly loss for Alabama everybody wanted to make it out to be. They were a good team. Not someone Alabama should have lost to, but a good team. And they showed that again against South Carolina, and they deserve a lot of credit. On South Carolina's part, you noted this, and I want to transition into a discussion about quarterbacks. Throughout the country, we are seeing so many guys that were highly touted quarterbacks that are failing to impress. And we flagged preseason I felt pretty confident that we didn't know anywhere near as much as we thought about those quarterbacks. I felt pretty confident that the guys that were being hyped probably weren't the guys that should be hyped. I based a lot of that conclusion, Daniel, on the fact that I looked at quarterbacks that were top 15 in the major statistics, yards per attempt, quarterback rating, that kind of stuff. And these big names don't come up, right? Lagway wasn't really part of that list. Klubnik's not part of that list. Aller's not part of that list. Guys were guys like Mateer. And I think, Daniel, we're seeing a transition in particular in college football where the dual threat quarterbacks that are running RPO schemes are just not as effective as they used to be. I think when you're playing inferior competition and you've got a talent advantage, that scheme still works. But football is becoming more kind of based on reads and old school football. Everything's cyclical. Defenses have caught up or adjusted, running more zone coverage, running more stuff that's traps, smaller players in the back end. Your ability to read zone, do a high-low read and make a throw, your ability to set the line of scrimmage, flip the play to run the ball, that stuff is winning the game now. And see guy open, throw ball to guy doesn't work in these complicated zone coverages and robbers. Lagway threw, 5 turnovers in that LSU game? I think we're seeing a shift in football back to heady quarterback play. And when I say heady, I just mean ability to process and run on the field. Look, people confuse understanding the scheme and being able to process live as two different things. Greg McElroy at Alabama was famously intelligent, and processing live, he was slow as molasses. I mean, he just kind of was. Those are two different skills. You've got to be able to put them together now, same way you had to 20, 30 years ago. And I think some quarterbacks are being hyped or falling off. I hated how many injuries we had last week. It was a devastating week for college football with a number of injuries. It was really depressing, frankly, to watch it. But, with all these teams, I think there's a reality that one of the reasons we're seeing so much shakeup and seeing teams like South Carolina, who's number 11, losing to Vanderbilt, obviously Sellers got hurt in that game. But Pavia was effective because he's a gamer. Aguilar's effective because he's a gamer. Mateer's effective because he's a gamer. Those guys are not NFL prospects. What they are veteran players that understand their scheme at a high level, that are able to throw on the run, but more importantly, figure out where they need to throw on the run, make the play based on the correct read, and get the ball to them. The era of Justin Fields sitting back there in the zone read and throwing a dot 40 yards downfield, I think has kind of moved on. Nico Iamaleava is great at those plays, and he's a terrible quarterback right now. And that's why the Aguilar-Nico trade worked out the way it did. I think that's why certain teams are struggling. It is less about pure arm talent, which ruled the day in the RPO, when it's about making this shot play downfield throw with accuracy. Real quick at the snap, usually not a lot of pressure, more about your release. It is more now about your ability to generally extend the play, but extend the play within the scheme, knowing where your protection is, knowing how to set your protection, and making reads. And like we said, Aguilar was almost just like lobbing the ball, but figure out where your one-on-one is, lob the ball to your advantage. Understand where leverage is, Oklahoma, right? Understand where your leverage is, understand where your opening is going to be, attack the hole in the zone with anticipation. That anticipation, understanding, processing is become the important part about football. And I think as the season goes on, we're going to see that play out, where the guys that have the feel for the game, even if they're worse quarterbacks from an NFL eval standpoint, are going to be the guys that win. And the game's much more now about, a Will Howard than it is maybe the superstar NFL first-round draft pick.
For those of y'all who have hung on this long, I've got 2 bonus nuggets for y'all. Notre Dame, first team in 37 years, Josh, to be still ranked after going 0-2 to start the season. I think that's fair. There's not 25 teams better than Notre Dame. I've also seen a lot of people complaining about, and I wanted to wrap it up, Josh, but I got to get your opinion on this. A lot of people are complaining about the interception that Aguilar threw yesterday. He threw it short into double coverage, and the Georgia wide receiver had his hands on the Tennessee receiver, did not impact the play at all. The safety intercepted it, not the corner. Short, underthrown ball into double coverage. I hate when people complain about a missed PI in that situation. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I mean, look, PIs go uncalled a lot. And let's be real, there was a lot of physicality in the Georgia-Tennessee game in the DB side. I mean, again, Aguilar had a lot of jump balls where Brazel was put in a hand. And there's one time the broadcast didn't talk about it, but I really felt like there wasn't a lot of shoving, but he put his hand on the DB at Georgia and lifted up off him, which kept the Georgia player down to go up for the ball. And sometimes that gets called. I mean, you can call penalties in those physical games all the time, and they didn't do it. They didn't do it consistently. And we say this a lot, Daniel. I don't know how many times, right? The SEC does not call many penalties in big games. They very rarely call holding unless it's on the edge or clearly impacts the play. They don't call pass interference unless the contact is clearly before the ball got there and impacts and it's clear contact. They tend to let them play physical. They tend to let them be grabby. And honestly, we didn't talk about it, Daniel, but it's probably a reason why the score sometimes goes up, because the ability to grab and tug and get away with push-offs does help the offense more often than it hurts. So yeah, I mean, in isolation, I think it's a bad call, but just like anything with all these SEC refs, you're going to find a million examples, like the Notre Dame game with A&M, of an uncalled hold. I guarantee if you go through the tape, you're going to find 10 more on both sides. The SEC refs just don't call holds in those situations nearly as often as they probably frankly should. It does tend to favor underdogs, does tend to favor the offense, but it just is what it is.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on this super long recap. Again, let us know in the comments if you made it to the end and you like these. We will keep doing them. It's a lot of fun for us. We like talking actual ball, not so much hypothetical. So we're going to keep doing them probably whether you like them or not. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.